And good morning. It's great to be back with you after being gone for a couple of weeks. I just want to echo what Monica was saying about how grateful we are to have been able to go to the CBWC conference in Banff. Monica and I think it's fair to say for both Monica and I that Banff is one of our favorite places to go probably in the world, right? And it was great to go for this conference. Great to be able to network with some of the other pastors from the denomination. And we had a wonderful, it was even great because there were some people that we had known that we didn't know were part of this conference. And so it was good to be able to get reacquainted with them. So thank you on behalf of Monica and I for the real privilege it was to be able to go. I also want to thank Andre and Tia for sort of holding down the fort here while we were away. Although I didn't get the memo about this being a Ninja Turtle theme morning. Greg, you never thought to tell me that. So if I had known, I would have dressed accordingly. But, you've all heard the saying before that boys will be boys, right? Have you heard that saying? But that statement was especially true for Rudolf and Adolf Dassler. I don't know if you've heard of those two names before. But they were two brothers that grew up in Germany in the early 1900s. And from day one, they epitomized the term sibling rivalry. Their mother would always be pulling the two of them off each other, and they would be fighting, and they'd be trying to one-up each other. And they were incredibly competitive. And apparently, when they were older, they would even try and steal one another's girlfriends. Don't know quite what that looked like, but they were known for that. But they eventually also found a way to work together, and they started their own business in their mother's laundry room, of all places, in the 1920s. And believe it or not, they decided that they wanted to make and sell shoes to the small community that they were living in. After just a few short years, the company had grown, and they used to spend hours a week dreaming of expanding their business together. And finally, in the year 1936, they got their big break when they were asked to design footwear for the U.S. Olympic athlete Jesse Owens. But their sibling rivalry would take an ugly turn because the two were said to have had creative differences in the direction of the company. And during the war, Rudolf was actually accused of sympathizing with the Nazis and even accused of working with the SS. As the story came out, it was his brother Adolf that had made this false accusation about him. And after the war, the two brothers just couldn't figure out a way to work together anymore, and their factory was split in two in 1946. Well, since then, their companies have gone on to grow and succeed really at an international level. And if those boys' names didn't sound familiar to you, then maybe the names of their companies will. Puma and Adidas. Well, today we're looking at someone whose story is, I would guess, likely permanently ingrained in all of our psyches, especially if you've grown up in the church. This story is about a man who comes from what could be called the world's, or maybe even the Bible's, most dysfunctional family. And the sibling rivalry that he faced with his 12 brothers is the stuff that we think really only happens in books and in movies. Today, of course, we're looking at the story of Joseph. And one of the things that makes his story and his character so gripping and heroic is that he, maybe even more than any of the other heroes that we've looked at in this hero series, is that he had what we could call moral greatness. He wasn't a warrior, but he had insight and he had foresight. He didn't have superhuman strength like Samson, the character we looked at a few weeks ago, but he had principles that he stuck to and he lived by. He didn't even have great leadership abilities, although he did become a very powerful leader. But his real strength came from his incredibly deep faith that ruled his decisions and controlled every aspect of his character. His heroism is talked about in Hebrews 11, verses 22, where we read these words about him. He says, "By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones." So keeping in mind that Hebrews 11 In the other heroes of the faith have these larger than life descriptions of what made them a hero. It's easy to look at this passage and kind of scratch your head, isn't it? And to say, what is this all about? For those of you who know the story of Joseph, you know that it's really not hard for us to call him a hero, because his life certainly was filled with decisions and courage and all kinds of things that we would want to emulate. But when the author of Hebrews writes about why he should be considered a hero, you might ask, is this really the best that they could come up with? Well, to find the answer to why he was called a hero for these things, we really do need to understand something about his story. Because the events of this passage are talking about events that really occurred at the very end of Joseph's life. They occur after he was sold into slavery by his brothers, and after he was imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit, after he was elevated to this powerful place in the Egyptian government, and they occur after he shows incredible mercy in that moment with his brothers. So what's the big deal that this passage is talking about? Well, the story of Joseph is found in chapters 35 to 50 of the book of Genesis. In fact, the story takes up a third of the entire book of Genesis. And to understand what Hebrews 11 is trying to teach us, we have to go back and look what brought Joseph to the point where he said what he did that is recorded in Hebrews 11. And that, again, was at the end of his life. The life of Joseph is quite a lengthy story, and it's this dramatic narrative that takes place really in three primary locations. Firstly, while Joseph was living at home. Secondly, while Joseph was in captivity. And thirdly, while Joseph was overseeing a good part of Egypt. And this morning we're going to skim very quickly over each of those time periods, because ultimately they help us to understand why in Hebrews 11:22 that defines him as a hero the way it does at the very end of his life. So firstly, let's take a look at his life at home. So for the first 24 years of Joseph's life, his greatest adversaries were absolutely his brothers. Joseph was born the youngest of 12, and you get the feeling when you read this passage in Genesis that he might have been a little bit unexpected by his parents. He was kind of the oops baby. Did they still call them that? It's kind of the oops baby, at least from a human perspective. Anyway, certainly not from God's. This passage in Genesis also makes it clear that he was his father's favorite. Now, I know that there's a lot of us that probably think to ourselves that our parents loved our siblings more than they loved us, right? But in this particular case, it was absolutely true. It was true that Jacob did love Joseph more than any of his other sons, and the whole family knew it, and it was obvious. In fact, it caused some significant problems between Joseph and his brothers. We're told in chapter 37, this is what we read. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word against him. So the dad would buy Joseph things that he wouldn't buy for the other brothers, like a special coat of many colors. He would give Joseph the easiest chores, would always sit with him at family meals. And we're told that Joseph was quick to tell his father about any mischief or wrongdoing that the brothers would get into. And then there were those dreams, right? And from an early age, we know that Joseph had this special ability to interpret dreams. And his brothers didn't take kindly to that special talent. In fact, on 2 separate occasions, he had these dreams which he interpreted to mean that he would eventually be ruling over his brothers. Now, 20/20 hindsight is one thing, right? And we know that those dreams would eventually come true. But you really have to question Joseph's judgment in telling his brothers about those dreams. They weren't impressed when they heard it from him. They weren't impressed with his special gift, and it causes this huge rift that we can see between him and them. In fact, because of the favoritism from the father and these dreams, they hated him. Well, as the story is told, one day when the rest of the boys were out tending the sheep and Joseph was at home spending quality time with his father and not tending sheep, interestingly enough, his father, Jacob, decided to send him out to check up on his brothers. And if this were a movie we were watching, when he arrives where his brothers were, you would hear the music changing to a minor key, suggesting that something really bad was about to happen. I don't know what the boys had been talking about before Joseph came, but I would suspect that he was the topic of conversation, because when the brothers saw him, the Bible tells us that they immediately made plans to kill him. As he was a ways off, they said, Genesis 37, starting at verse 19, "Here comes that dreamer. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. So they do this, and then being hungry from all the bullying, right? Because bullying makes you very hungry. They went and had lunch, is what we're told. Verse 25 says, "And they sat down to eat their meal. They looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, 'What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood.' And his brothers agreed. So rather than killing him, they decided to sell him into slavery, which destined him to a life of being bought and sold, right? And it turned him from a person into what was now a possession. When we pick up the story in the next chapter, we find that an Egyptian has purchased him. Joseph ended up being bought by an Egyptian named Potiphar, who we will soon find out in this story was one of Pharaoh's officials. And he begins to have this incredible amount of success in the work that he was doing. In fact, we're told on a couple of occasions in the passage that he found great favor in Potiphar's eyes. And as often happens when you succeed at your job, you get a promotion, right? Potiphar began to put him in charge of more and more things until Joseph was basically the second in command of all of Potiphar's affairs. Now, don't forget that he's still a slave and he is still a possession by Egyptian standards, but he has grown from being this favored child in a very dysfunctional family to who he is now, someone who's showing himself to be faithful and teachable and a good worker and reliable. Now, during this time, Potiphar's wife, and we know this story, don't we? Potiphar's wife begins to take notice of Joseph, and as you know, she actually wanted to sleep with him. Joseph refused, and one day he literally ran away from her, but as he was doing that, he left his cloak behind, and Potiphar's wife used that to frame him by telling her husband that Joseph had tried to rape her. Of course, no one would believe him, right? He's a slave. Why would they believe him? So he was immediately sent to prison. And while Joseph was in prison, he spent a lot of time waiting on God and wanting God to move. While he's in there, he meets these two guys, the cupbearer and the baker. And one night, the two men have dreams, and the next day they share their dreams with Joseph. And God gives Joseph the ability to interpret the dreams, which both end up coming true after 3 days. The cupbearer was reinstated as his dreams said, and the baker was executed. He was hung, according to what Joseph had said would happen. Cupbearer promises to talk to Pharaoh about Joseph, but he didn't. And we don't know why. Maybe he forgot. Maybe he was just so happy to be out that he never did. Maybe he didn't want to rock the boat, or maybe he was just simply scared to have that conversation. I wonder, can you imagine being Joseph in that moment, in prison for a crime that you didn't commit? You know, placing all your hopes in this one guy who you've done time with, who you've also done a great favor for, and he repays you by doing nothing. In fact, for 2 more years, Joseph was in jail. 2 years. It was 2 years later that we're told that Pharaoh had a dream, and we're told that he was greatly troubled by the dream. He told his dream to really everyone that he knew, but no one could tell Pharaoh what it meant. It was at this point that the cupbearer spoke up and said, "Pharaoh, I know of a guy. Joseph is the guy who interpreted my dream. So Joseph was summoned to Pharaoh, and as we know, he interpreted the dream, and he interpreted it correctly. Now, predicting the future at the best of times is a tricky proposition, but in this case, Pharaoh believed that these dreams represented messages that he was being given by the Egyptian gods. So if it was misinterpreted, it would have had grave consequences. You know, it really is funny, isn't it, when people try and predict the future. Back in 1926, Lee DeForest, who is the inventor of the cathode ray tube, remember those things that used to be in your television sets? He said, theoretically, television may be a feasible object, but I consider it an impossibility, and further development would be nothing but a waste of time. In 1943, Thomas J. Watson, the chairman of the board of IBM, said, I think there is probably over the whole world a market for, maybe 5 computers. And in 1962, a recording company expert wrote, we don't think that the Beatles will ever do anything in the market. You know, guitar groups, well, they're on their way out. You know, the implications of the mistakes that these people made wasn't great. But the implications for Joseph, if he was wrong, would have been huge. So Joseph tells Pharaoh what his dream means, and Pharaoh's dream means that there was going to be 7 years of harvest and then 7 years of drought and famine. Joseph told Pharaoh that he had a plan to store food for the famine, or otherwise everybody was going to die. So Pharaoh was so pleased with Joseph's interpretation and his wisdom that this is what he says in chapter 41 of Genesis. He says, the plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning or as wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So he makes Joseph the head of the palace, tells all the Egyptians that they were now to submit to his orders. And he becomes the second in command of all of Egypt. Which really brings us to Joseph's third location, and that was in Egypt. So Pharaoh puts Joseph immediately in a position of power and he could really do whatever he wanted to be ready for the famine. And in chapter 41, he continues, and this is what we're told. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, make way, make way. Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift a hand or a foot in all of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Can you imagine? I mean, you want to talk about a rags to riches story. Joseph has gone from being this hated brother to a slave, from a convicted criminal to the second in command of all of Egypt in just a few short years. We're told that while Joseph was in charge, he stored up food to prepare for the famine, and in 7 years they had enough. So much, in fact, that all of the nations around them were actually coming to Egypt to buy their food so that they could survive. And then, if you know the story, you know that life in many ways comes full circle to Joseph, doesn't it? Because one day his brothers arrive in Egypt, and they've come not knowing that he's still alive to buy food. But the crazy thing is that they don't even recognize him, probably because they were just assuming that he was long gone. After 25 years of separation from his family, the tension of the jealousy and the sibling rivalry and the personal rejection that began all the way back in Genesis 37 finds its resolution in Genesis 45. And after a few tests that Joseph does towards his brothers to see if they had actually changed, Joseph eventually tells his brothers that he was Joseph. And he says these words to them in chapter 45, and I love these words. He says, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one that you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and the ruler of Egypt. Joseph then, as we know, sent them home back to their father Jacob, and they were to bring him back to Egypt. And we're told that this is what he told them to tell his father. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me, you and your children and your grandchildren, your flocks, your herds, and all you have. I will provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become desolate. And you know, the really cool thing about this passage is that Joseph cared for his whole family, saving them from the famine. And they lived together in Egypt for the rest of Joseph's life. Joseph served for almost 80 years as the second in command of Egypt. You know, I find it so interesting when you look over Joseph's whole life and realize that he really wasn't treated fairly, was he? He wasn't treated fairly by his brothers, by Potiphar, by the cupbearer, by Potiphar's wife. And yet he continually gave people what they didn't deserve from him. So that's, in a nutshell, Joseph's life story. And I'm sure you'd agree that there's lots of reasons in here alone that are worthy of him being called a hero of the faith. But you know, the event that's talked about, again, going back to Hebrews 11, all of the events that we've just read have been leading up to a single moment that occurred right before Joseph's death. And this is what we're told about that event in Genesis 50, starting at verse 22. Joseph stayed in Egypt along with all his father's family. He lived 110 years and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children. Also, the children of Mechar, son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. Those were his grandkids. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land, the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. That was verse 26. So I want you to picture this with me. Everything you know about Joseph, and having just read about this incident at the end of his life, picture this with me. So while Joseph was gathered in this moment with his children and his grandkids, he starts speaking about the divine plan of God, but not just the plan that God had for him, but also his family and for the nation of Israel, because when Joseph invited his family to come, we know that those were the descendants of the nation of Israel. So he wasn't just saving his family, he was saving the future plan that God had. In this moment, he's saying that he had seen God script his life and bring him to the point that he was at right now. And in his final words, this is what he wants them to know. He says, God has been faithful to me, and God is going to be faithful to you. And he is going to do what he said he was going to do, just as he was faithful to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Almost 300 years had passed since this point, since God first spoke to Abraham, and there still was no fulfillment of the promise, right? I mean, Joseph was now looking death in the face, and there was still no fulfillment of what God had said he was going to do. Yet he continued to look forward to the promised land that God had in store for his descendants. You know, even while he was, again, lying here close to death and enjoying his children and his grandkids, It's interesting what it is that is on the forefront of his mind. You know, what was dominating his thoughts was that someday that God was going to give his ancestors, his family, the promised land that he had said that he was going to do. So again, think about this, because when Jacob, Joseph's father, died, he asked to be married in Mekhapheth, which was his homeland. He asked to be buried in the land that he grew up in. He asked to be buried in the land that he was familiar with, and he asked to be buried in the land that his forefathers were buried in. He wanted to be buried side by side with his own relatives. Now contrast that to what Joseph is doing here. Because when he died, he didn't want to be buried in his homeland. He didn't want to be buried in the land that he had grown up in. He didn't want to be buried in the land that he was familiar with, and he didn't even want to be buried in the land that his forefathers were buried in. You know, and he specifically asked that he also not be buried in Egypt. Do you know that Joseph actually could have been buried in a pyramid if he wanted? It wasn't uncommon back then for those people who worked closest with Pharaoh, to have a say in where they were buried. But Joseph wasn't interested in having a pyramid named after him or becoming a famous mummy. I mean, he wasn't interested in having a group of Egyptians come to see him long after he was dead and gone. And he didn't care about a memorial that would be set up to remember the man who saved the Egyptians from this great famine. What Joseph wanted more than anything else was to be a part of what God was going to be doing in the future. As I was preparing for this message, I read a sermon that Spurgeon, the great preacher, had done on this passage, and one of his quotes was that Joseph wasn't interested in monuments, mummies, or money, but only his master. He wanted to be buried in the promised land. So the question is, what makes Joseph such a hero? Well, the answer to that is that he was not content to be buried back in his homeland or even Egypt. It was his dying wish to be buried someday in the promised land that his people didn't yet possess. He was such a man of faith that he wanted to be part of what God was doing on earth in the future, whether he was dead or alive. We know that because of Scripture that when Joseph died, he was embalmed. He was preserved in a way that the Egyptians did to all of their royalty. And they placed him in a coffin. But interestingly enough, in Egypt today, by the tomb of the Pharaoh Apophilus, which is actually believed to be the Pharaoh that Joseph would have worked with, there stands a tomb. You can go visit this today, a tomb of a prince whose name and titles are in hieroglyphic writing. The prince, whose bones is not found anywhere in this tomb, is given the name Atesophath. And many people are convinced that this is a tribute tomb to Joseph, that of course he never used because he didn't want to be buried there. They simply refer to the owner of this tomb as belonging to the director of the king's granaries. The specific name of the man is not really given, because if he had declined the honor of being buried within that tomb, it would be more of a monument to his deeds rather than a tomb that kept his stored body. And its purpose would be to remember the important role that he played in Egyptian history. So it's interesting that Genesis, the book of Genesis, think about it, it begins with creation and it ends with a casket. A very interesting follow-up to this story actually happens in Exodus chapter 13. And we talked a lot about Exodus during our summer series, Game of Stones. But in Exodus 13, as the Israelites were exiting Egypt right after they had been released because of the terrible plagues, Moses gives this command regarding the bones of Joseph. He commands this nearly 2 million Israelites who were moving quickly, to get out of town, to get out of Egypt. He says to them, stop. He says, where are the bones of Joseph? I mean, I wonder if you can imagine that scene. We don't very often stop and pause on what that was really all about, but this is what it was all about. Moses says, stop, where are the bones of Joseph? And you can just imagine the scene, can't you? No doubt somebody says, I don't know where they are. I wasn't on the casket committee this week. I don't know where Joseph's bones are. But Moses says, we're not going anywhere until we make sure that Joseph's bones are going with us. We're not leaving Egypt without him. I don't know how long it took to find Joseph's casket, but they find it. They find his coffin, and they bring it out of Egypt with them. They carried Joseph's casket out of Egypt through the Red Sea and throughout the wilderness wanderings. For the 40 years, they're carrying his casket filled with the bones. And some would say that there was more faith in the bones of Joseph than there likely were in the feet of the Israelites. The really cool thing about this story, and if you love history, then you likely know that in Joshua 24:32, this is what we're told. It says, and Joseph's bones, which the Israelites had brought up from Egypt, were buried at Shechem, the tract of land that Jacob bought for 100 pieces of silver from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. This became the inheritance of Joseph's descendants. So Joseph was buried exactly where he wanted to be, in the promised land. And what an incredible reward for Joseph's faith. As I read this story, I'm reminded that real faith is believing what God said would be so, even though it's not so, until it becomes so. Joseph had such an interesting life, and a life that was filled with terrible, terrible betrayals and things that had happened to him. Terrible things. And yet, I bet if we were to ask him, he would say that it was those events that helped to define his strength. It was those struggles. It was those false accusations. It was that time in prison where he learned what true faith in God really meant. I wonder so often if you and I see suffering, and if we see injustice and disappointments that we face in life in a very different light. Rarely do we ever trust that God could be doing something in our lives through those things, right? I think we're guilty of that. Yet it's so interesting that of all that Joseph did, out of all the incredible things that he did for the nation of Israel, with all of those things that happened to him, Joseph is remembered and commended in this passage for the words that he spoke on his deathbed. Abraham had 3 passages in Hebrews 11, 3 verses talking about his great acts of faith. Joseph has 1 sentence. And what was so important about Joseph's last words? These last words of Joseph show where his heart had been throughout his whole entire life. His home was the paradise that God had promised to the people that he had not seen. The only place that Joseph wanted to be buried was in the land that he had been hoping for and living for and striving for his entire life. My challenge to you as we wrap up this morning is simply this, is that faith in God is about the future. It is not about the past. And people of faith look to the future. They live for the future. They plan and prepare for the future. Faith is not about harking back to some bygone age, but it is about believing God for what he has promised in the future. Let's pray. God, thank you so much for the powerful lessons that we can learn from a man like Joseph. I want to thank you, Lord, for giving him the strength and the perspective and the heart to stay faithful, even through all the ups and downs that life brought him. Lord, the betrayal, the being in prison. I thank you, Lord, that we can take that example and we can apply it to our own situations, because, none of us maybe deal with anything quite that dramatic, but we all deal with betrayal. We all deal with situations where maybe we feel like we're in prison. Maybe we feel like we're in a place that we just never imagined. And to think about Joseph being in prison for years and years and years, and how he kept believing that you were with him every step of the way. Father, just give us that same ability to cling to the promises that you've made. Help us to be people that look to the future and understand that even though we don't understand what might be happening in the present, God, that we will cling to the future that you promise that you have for each and every one of us. We love you, Lord. That is our prayer.